What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Common Coder. My name is Josh, and in this video we're going to be learning about CSS Compound Selectors. Compound selectors are a feature of CSS that allows us to combine multiple basic selectors and do some pretty cool things to target and style our elements. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Now, before we get started, there are a couple prerequisites in order to follow along with this video. The first one is that you'll want to make sure you have a basic understanding of HTML. So you'll want to know the basic HTML structure and what things like elements and attributes are. You'll also want to have an understanding of basic CSS selectors because we'll be using these to create our compound selectors. So you'll want to make sure you know what element, ID, class, and attribute selectors are. Now, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code exclusively throughout this demo, but you should be able to follow along using the editor of your choice. I prefer VS Code because I find its HTML and CSS features to be very good. And as you'll see, it has some tooling to help us visualize our selectors as we write them. And the last thing, if you want to follow along using the same code that I'm using in this video, you'll want to make sure you have an understanding of Git and GitHub and how to either download the source code or clone a repository to your own machine. Now you can find the code for this video at github.com/the-common-coder/css-compound-selectors-demo. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but there is a link down in the description below, so you don't have to memorize all of that. All right, now let's start learning about CSS compound selectors. All right, so what exactly are compound selectors? Well, like we mentioned previously, compound selectors are a way to combine multiple basic CSS selectors to do some really interesting things with targeting and styling your elements. Now, it's important to note here that compound selectors are not the same as CSS combinators. So even though the name sounds similar, compound selectors are used to target elements that meet multiple criteria, whereas CSS combinators are used to define relationships between elements. And so we're going to do a whole nother video on CSS combinators in the future. So if you want to see that, definitely hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you know when that video comes out. Now, CSS combinators are pretty much the gateway to more advanced CSS concepts, including things like the cascade, inheritance, specificity, and combinators like we previously talked about. And like I said, we're going to be doing videos on every single one of these topics, so definitely hit that subscribe button if you want to learn more in the future. Now, there's two main use cases for compound selectors. The first one we've already talked about, and that is the more precise targeting of elements. So using compound selectors, you can select an element that matches multiple criteria. So for example, rather than just selecting a certain type of element using an element selector or selecting an element that has a particular class, you can select a certain type of element that also has a particular class or even a particular set of classes. And so we'll see examples of that in just a minute. The second use case for compound selectors is that it really helps promote the idea of code reuse and maintainability. So compound selectors allow us to take advantage of CSS inheritance so that we can reuse our styles and write less code. And the acronym here is called DRY, which stands for don't repeat yourself. So if you ever find yourself repeating your code, it's usually a good indication that there's probably some patterns or best practices that you can use to not have to repeat yourself. And like I said, we're going to see examples of both of these here in the upcoming slides and the demo. All right, so here's our first example of what a compound selector looks like. So as you can see, it's made up of multiple basic selectors. Right here we have a span, which is an element selector, followed by a dot highlight, which is a class selector. And so by combining the two, you basically squish them together. So there's no spaces or anything like that. You're literally just combining selectors to make a more specific selector to target elements that meet multiple criteria. So in this case, this would apply to any span that has a class of highlight, and that would set the background color to yellow and set the font size to 1.5 rem. Our second example combines an element selector with an attribute selector. And so in this case, we'd be selecting any input with a type attribute that has a value of text. And you can see in this example, we'd be setting the border radius to 5 pixels and the font size to 1.5 rem. And this helps avoid accidental styling of elements that might also have the same attribute name with a matching value. All right, in our third example here, we have a combination of two class selectors. So we are using the .btn class selector combined with the .primary. So we're targeting any element that has a class of btn and also the class of primary. In this case, we are setting the color to white, so that's going to be the text color, and setting the background color to blue. And so you can kind of see where we're going with this here. We could have different button types, so we can maybe have a primary button and a info button and a warning button and a success button, things like that, and we can use these compound selectors to fine tune the styling. But as we'll also see, we can set the main styles, kind of our base styles on the button class itself, and just overwrite the ones that we want by using the compound selector. And so like I said, we'll see examples of that in the code. And speaking of the code, it is now time for the demo. So let's go ahead and jump over to VS Code. All right, so here we are in VS Code. And like I mentioned previously, if you want to follow along, you can get the code that I'm using in this demo from this repository here on GitHub, which I will link down in the description below. So the only thing that you'll have to do to follow along is inside the style CSS. Once you've downloaded or cloned it to your machine, go ahead and clear out the styles that are in these two sections down here at the bottom, because we'll be writing these from scratch. So let's first take a look at the HTML. We have a very simple HTML page that has an H1. It's got a main section that consists of a section which has an H2 and a paragraph about compound selectors. Also has a form that has a name and an email field, a checkbox for subscribing to a fictitious newsletter, and a submit and a reset button. And so there's already some base styles here. If we look at the style sheet, you can see we're just using basic CSS selectors that we covered in the basic CSS selectors video. So if you haven't checked that out and you're not familiar with any of these selectors here, go ahead and check that out first and then jump back over to this video, and you'll see the page that we're looking at is actually very similar to what we did in that video. So if we go ahead and open this up with live server, we can see here is our page. So we have our header section up here at the top, then we have our H2 followed by our paragraph with a couple different styles inside of it. We have our form at the bottom, our checkbox, and our two buttons. And so what we're going to do is use some compound CSS selectors to limit the scope of some of these styles and also promote the reuse of some of the styles so that we don't have to repeat ourselves over and over and over again. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, and so you can see that up here in the class selector section, we have a class of highlight, and all this is doing is setting the background color to yellow. And so this is fine. This works. I can actually apply this to any element that I want to, but as a developer, we might want to restrict this style so that it only applies to certain types of elements. And so for example, if I go to my HTML, there's nothing stopping me right now from, say, applying this highlight class to this H2. So I can say class equals highlight, save that, and now my H2 up here at the top has the highlight class. Now, it's not really doing anything other than highlighting this, but if we're creating a utility class, maybe we want to limit it so that we apply it to spans that we can use inside of a paragraph, which is exactly what we're doing here. So we can use a compound selector to achieve this. So if we go into our styles.css, what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove this highlight class from here, and then I'm going to drop it down in here in my compound selector section. And to make this a compound selector, what we can do is go ahead and say span.highlight. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, using VS Code, we can actually get a preview of how this selector is going to apply to our elements. So you can see that if I hover over the compound selector, it's telling me that it's going to target a span that has a class of highlight. And so this will restrict that highlight class so that it only applies to span elements. And so if I go ahead and save this, you'll see that my highlight on my H2 goes away because now I have a more specific selector that is targeting span elements only. Now, the next thing you'll notice is that we have this disabled class here, which basically gives a disabled effect to our element by setting the opacity to 0.5 and setting the cursor to not allowed. And so if I apply this to one of my buttons, let's go ahead and go into the HTML, and for the submit button, I'll go ahead and apply this to this button. So I'll put the disabled attribute on here. Go ahead and save that. And you can see what that's done is kind of grayed out the button. And when I hover over it, you'll actually notice that I'm getting the pointer because of the CSS cascade here. So the way I've defined the styles in this style sheet, the disabled rule is up here, setting the cursor to not allowed. However, the button class is below that, and the way the CSS cascade works is that rules are applied in order, and so anything that has the same specificity, so for example, if I hover over this disabled rule, selector specificity is 0, 1, 0. If I hover over this button rule, you can see that the specificity is also 0, 1, 0, and so since this rule comes after this one, whatever properties that I set in this rule will overwrite any other property that might appear in the rules that precede it. So again, this is getting into more advanced CSS concepts, but just know there is an order of operations when it comes to applying styles to HTML elements. And so by using something like a compound selector, we can increase the specificity and be a little bit more specific about the elements that we're targeting. And so like I said, we'll do a whole video explaining how this works and what those numbers mean. But for now, just know that element selectors are less specific than class selectors, which are less specific specific than ID selectors. And when you start combining these things together, your specificity values increase, which means that those rules will take precedence over rules that have lesser specificity whenever there's a conflict. So this disabled attribute looks really good on our button, minus the cursor problem that we have. But let's just say I want to apply it to my checkbox here. So if I go into my HTML and I go to my checkbox and I add the disable attribute here, so you can see that the checkbox is almost invisible because a checkbox has a pretty decent disabled style right out of the box. Same thing for an input. So if I go into my input and I add a disabled to my email input, you can see that it's barely visible because we're dimming it out so much. So, we want to be a little bit more specific with our selectors, again, to not only make sure that our styles are being applied correctly, but also, we want to be able to have the flexibility to apply different types of styles depending on what element it is. So in this case, my disabled attribute selector, I only want to apply to this button. So let's go ahead and remove all these disableds that I added here. So let's get rid of that one, that one, and we'll put it back actually on this button. All right, so what we can do is go into our styles, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and cut this out of this section here, and then down in my compound selectors, I'm going to go ahead and paste it underneath my span highlight. And like I mentioned, I only want this disabled rule to apply to button elements. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and make a compound selector that says, okay, any button that also has an attribute of disabled, go ahead and apply this style. And now you can see that this selector, if I hover over it, it has a different specificity value, which is 011. And when I go over to my HTML, you can see that now not only is the button being styled with that opacity, but I'm also getting the cursor because now this rule is more specific than this one up here. And even if I was to swap these around in the sheet and mess with the cascade a little bit, because this rule is more specific than this one, again, I get the styling that I expect. So again, compound selectors, all about being more specific in terms of what you're trying to select. So moving on, let's do the same thing for this attribute selector. So we have this attribute selector with a type of text. Now, this type of text is pretty much exclusive to input elements, but there's really nothing stopping me from putting that attribute on something else. So for example, if I go to this paragraph and I add a type equals text here and save it, this actually doesn't look that bad, but this is probably something that we don't want to happen, right? We don't want to allow adding this attribute of type text to any other element and having those styles apply when we might not want them to. So again, we can use a compound selector to prevent that from happening. So if I go back into my styles.css, I'm gonna go ahead and cut this out of here, and I'll just delete the attribute selector comment since we don't need it. And down here, underneath my button disabled, I'll go ahead and paste this in here. And what we're gonna do is make sure that this applies specifically to input elements with a type of text. Now, if I save this, you notice nothing changes because this was already targeting these elements here. But now you'll see that if I go into my index and then re-add the type of text, that no longer applies to my paragraph or any other element that's not an input. We can also take this a step further, and let's say maybe we have different types of forms on our page, and one's going to get this styling here, and maybe we want to provide a different type of styling to input elements in a different section. So maybe it's a modal, maybe it's like a search box up here at the top. There's lots of different things that we could do here. So another thing that we could do is combine not only the input element selector with the attribute selector, we can also tack on a class selector to be really specific about which input elements we want to target. So what we can do is go ahead and create a class selector at the end of this called form control. And so you can see by adding that form control, now my inputs revert to the browser defaults. And so to get this style to apply, what we need to do is go into our form and then go ahead and add the class of form control to these elements. And so you can see that restyles my name input. And then I'm gonna go ahead and just copy this and paste it into my email input. And now I have my styles back. And so this is actually how frameworks like Bootstrap achieve their styling, by also giving you flexibility and control over your element. And so again, this is all about combining different basic selectors to target elements that meet multiple criteria. All right, the last thing that we're gonna do for this compound selector section is do a little bit of styling to our buttons. And so again, we have the same problem with our buttons. If we go up here, this button style will essentially apply to anything with the class of BTN. So there's nothing stopping me from going into my HTML and adding a class to a paragraph, for example, of BTN. And then Again, doesn't really look too bad, but not exactly what we want. So we want to limit the use of the button class to only apply to button and anchor tags. So we designed this selector specifically so that it can be used with anchor tags. So that way links, anchor tags are for links, can look like buttons. And so let's go ahead and remove the style from here. Actually, I'm going to keep it here just for demonstration purposes, just for a second. Now, if I go into my styles, let's go ahead and copy our button class. Actually cut it out of here and then paste it down here at the bottom. And what we're going to do here is use a combination of a compound selector and also a group selector, because we want to, again, target anchor tags, and we also want to target button elements. And so to do that, we haven't really talked about group selectors, but the concept is pretty simple. We're going to essentially target two different things and apply the same styles to both. So for buttons, we can say button.btn, and that will target buttons with the btn class. And we can see here that we don't have any links in this case, so we're not seeing the links being styled, but we can go ahead and add one and just demo that. So we can say href, we'll just say pound, click me, and then a class of btn. All right, so notice it's not applying to this element here because we have scoped this button class to only apply to button elements. So to get to also apply to our anchor tag, we can create a group selector by adding a comma and then adding our second selector. So in this case, we also want a, which is the anchor tag, with a class of btn. All right, and now you can see that once I save that, my link now gets a styling that looks like a button. Now, the other thing that we can do is use these compound selectors to essentially combine CSS styles. And so this gets into the concept of inheritance, where let's just say I have a button with a class of btn. If I wanted to, say, change the color and the background color of my button, rather than recreating this whole entire style, I can use a compound selector to precisely change just the properties I want by creating a more specific selector, essentially. So let's go ahead and see how that works. So I have these series of buttons here, and let's just say I wanted to create a primary button, which would be like a blue, and then maybe a danger button, which would be a red. So how would we do that without rewriting all of these styles here? And so what we can do is take advantage of inheritance in CSS to inherit all of these styles and overwrite the specific properties we want to change by creating a more specific selector. So what we can do is, if I want to create a primary button, I can say, all right, let's go ahead and target any button that has a class of btn, and then that also has a class of primary. And since we're supporting anchor tags, we're going to want to do this with the anchor tags as well. So we'll say a.btn.primary. So I'm going to target any button element that has a class of btn that also has a class of primary. You can see what this looks like up here at the top. So button class, it's going to have a btn and primary. Same thing with the anchor tag, it's going to have a class of btn and a class of primary. And you can see that the specificity number jumps up, which means that any properties here will overwrite any properties that are inside of less specific selectors that target the same element. So what I can do here is, for the primary, I can say background color, and we'll set that to Dodger blue. And so by using this more specific selector and using a primary class on this as well, it's going to change the background color from this gray to this blue. And by doing that, we also want to change the font color, and we want to change that to white. All right, and so nothing happens because I don't have a primary button. So let's go back to my index, and for my submit button, let's go ahead and add a class of primary, save that. And now you can see that I get a bluish color. Let's go ahead and remove the disabled so we can see what it looks like in full opacity. And that looks pretty nice. So you have a nice blue primary button with some white text, and then you can reuse those styles on any button you want to give kind of this primary button look to. And so similarly for the reset, so this is kind of a destructive action. So if I type things into the form and then I click reset, you can see that it resets those input elements. So we want to give the user kind of a visual cue that, hey, this is a destructive thing. So let's go ahead and create a danger button. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing here. We'll say button.btn.danger, and then same thing for the anchor tag, a.btn.danger. We're going to set the background color to red, and again, set the font color to white. Save that, and now let's go back to our HTML and add that class to our reset button. So we'll say danger, And so now we have a pretty prominent reset button that gives the user a visual cue that this is going to be a destructive action. You would probably want to confirm, using JavaScript, some kind of modal that we do want to reset the form or cancel out of the form, but you get the idea, right? So we're adding different UI elements to give the user a better experience. Now, along those same lines, we could also do the same thing to provide other visual cues to some other elements. So for example, I'm sure you've probably seen if you ever enter in some information inside a form incorrectly, you'll get like a red highlight around or on the input element that you're working with. And so we can use a compound selector to do that as well. So for example, if I wanted to create one of those for an input element, I can say, okay, I want to target any input that has a type of text. Say type equals text. And then that also has the form control, because this is where I've established my style that we're using for our form input elements with this form control. And then if it also has a danger class on it, then we can change the border color and we can change that to red. And so now if I'm working with the form and my form has an error, programmatically through JavaScript, we could check for the validity of the form and then give the user some information that the form element is incorrect. So let's say they enter an email address incorrectly, we could add the class of danger. And then so now we get a red border around the input element, which gives the user some feedback, letting them know that this part of their form is incorrect and they need to do something to fix that. And so you can see by using compound selectors, we can not only get specific with the elements that we are targeting, but we can also take advantage of some of these base classes that we've already established and then make tweaks and changes to those elements by creating more specific selectors that inherit all the base styles from more generic selectors, and then fine tune and tweak what we want to do by creating more specific selectors to change the properties that we want. And so you can see how nice it is that for each one of these, we didn't have to recopy all of these styles or recopy all of these styles. We just create another selector, tack on another class that's going to modify the properties that we want, and then make our changes accordingly, which is pretty cool. And so again, all of this is kind of based on the idea of CSS specificity, which we're going to cover in another video. So definitely hit that subscribe button if you want to learn more about that, because understanding that is actually very helpful when you start having lots and lots of styles in your style sheet and you're trying to figure out why certain styles aren't applying the way you think they're going to. All right, well, that is going to go ahead and do it for this video on compound CSS selectors. As always, thank you so much for coding along with me today. If you liked this video and found this information valuable, please leave a like down below, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing. We're going to be learning a lot more about web development, including more CSS concepts like specificity, inheritance, the cascade, and more advanced selectors like CSS combinators. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I would love to have you along for the journey. Well, until next time, be sure to stay curious, never stop learning, and I will see you all in the next video.